So, I'd like to begin with a quote from Introducing Hinduism. I think it's page 10. The author says that when dates cannot be established with certainty, there are cultural, political, and religious agendas that may play roles in the attribution of dates, like how old this ancient history is and so on. For instance, a person who reads scriptures literally may choose to believe that certain events took place long before historians would place these events based on the evidence at their disposal. So this is a typical distinction being drawn here in our textbook between people that read scriptures literally and base their conclusions on a type of faith, and people who are more rigorous and simply base their conclusions on the evidence at hand. And so the point I want to make is that if we study the history of the historiography of ancient India, in other words, historiography means writing history. So as an academic discipline, studying the ancient history of India, the religious history of India has its own history, which is nothing but a series of amazing agendas, political, cultural, religious agendas. So since we're going to be talking about the history of India, the history of Indian religion, I want to talk about the amazing, almost shocking ways at times that people in the West studied India and what their own agendas were. It's an amazing story. So I didn't get around last time to explaining that in India, and not only in India, but in the ancient world in general, they had a very clear conception of time. And time, not only in India, but also, let's say, in the Greco-Roman civilization, often tended to be not so much seen as linear as in the Middle Eastern tradition, biblical traditions, that there was nothing. Then God created the world, and from the moment of creation, time just starts, the clock starts ticking, and it just moves in a straight line from that first moment of creation. Big Bang Theory, for example, they've taken the same biblical linear conception of time. There was nothing, then at a certain time there was a creation event, and the clock starts ticking, and time moves in one direction, and it keeps getting farther and farther away from that original creation event, whether it's a Big Bang or the biblical account. What we find is in the ancient world, whether it's in Aristotle or in the Bhagavad Gita and so on, is a cyclical sense of time. In the sense, just as we have 4 seasons. Well, you all know that. We have 4 seasons. And the seasons come again and again. Now, if you were talking about, let's say, for example, winter happened in Florida, and it was actually the first time in your life you'd ever experienced anything like winter, you would pay very careful attention to it. You might even write about it because you'd never seen a winter before, or you'd never seen a summer before. But if you've lived through, dozens of winter, well, that's not possible at your age, but if you've lived through many, many seasons, then you can talk about seasons in general, so that if you're an artist and you're painting a picture of fall or winter, or if you're talking about, writing a poem about it, there's a general sense of what winter is, or summer. So the same way, in the ancient Vedic civilization, and in Hindu civilization, also in Greek civilization, Rome, they have the sense that time goes through cycles. The earth is moving through cycles. You find this in Hesiod. Hesiod and Homer were the 2 great writers of ancient Greece. And so the sense of this vast time, the time has been going on for millions and millions of years. The people have existed for millions and billions of years. And so that's time. Then when we talk about space, there's a very strong sense in India that it's a holy land. Just like people that live in Israel have a sense that it's a holy land. So in India, every river, every hill, every mountain, every forest has some type of sacred event associated with it. You have these ancient literatures that we'll be studying in more detail, like Puranas, Itihasas. So in India, literally everywhere you go, as I said, every forest, every river, every mountain has a sacred history associated with it, and many of these histories go back a very long time. So until the Europeans came to India and actually took over India, politically and militarily, people lived in this world in which they were living within this vast time dimension. It's like if you stand on the top of a high mountain and look out and you get a very good view. So people had this temporal view. They associated their land, their culture with almost this endless time and cosmic cycles and so on and so forth. Now, the Europeans came with a very different picture of things. And two things were happening in Europe. To understand Indology, to understand the academic study of India, you have to understand Europe, because Europe invented the academic study of India. And something happened around 1786, which completely shocked Europe, and it happened in India. It was a discovery made by Sir William Jones. Sir William Jones was the governor of East India under the East India Company. I mean, for a long time, it was a private corporation that ruled India, not the English crown. The English crown only took over in the mid-1800s. We'll talk about all of that because of East India Company was basically blowing it. But for a long time, it was a private corporation that ruled India and had their own army and so on. So the governor of East India was Sir William Jones, who was also a scholar. I mean, think Thomas Jefferson, think John Adams. A gentleman back then was expected to know Greek, Latin, English, German, French, and so on. That was like entry level if you wanted to be considered a respectable gentleman. So Sir William Jones began to study Sanskrit, which is the ancient and sacred language of Asia. Not only India, but also the rest of Asia because of Buddhism. So anyway, there we go. He gave a speech to the Royal Asiatic Society, which he helped found around 1786. This is a year before the American Constitution and 11 years after the birth of Jane Austen. And so he gave a speech to the Royal Asiatic Society, and he said something which was an absolute bombshell, which actually completely changed European consciousness. So this is what he said. The Sanskrit language and language and race back then were considered basically synonymous. And back then also, I should say as a preface, then we'll get back to Sir William Jones, it was perfectly respectable to be a racist. There was nothing wrong. There was absolutely no stigma attached to racism. And everybody was a racist. The Indians were racist, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Africans, the Europeans. Racism back then, pre-Hitler, racism basically had the same moral status as nationalism today. If someone's a Guatemalan nationalist or a French nationalist or a Nigerian nationalist or whatever, no one considers that's evil. It may be a little small-minded. I mean, internationalism is sort of more in vogue right now for various reasons, but to be a nationalist is not in and of itself evil. And so nationalism, racism, they were all the same thing back then. And, be true to your school. Root for the home team. If you're white, if you're black, if you're Chinese, Japanese, Indian, it's natural that because, after all, people have big extended families. It's your people. It's your people. It's your tribe. It's your race. There's nothing wrong with it. So to this day in Mexico, they have a national holiday called El Día de la Raza, the Day of the Race. And they say, Viva la Raza, long live the race. So, anyway, we have to sort of think our way back to the way the world used to be. Hitler kind of ruined racism. But before that, it was just, it's like you support your family, you support your country, you support your race. It's like, what's the problem? So, also at that time, Europe was ascendant. Europe was on a total roll. I mean, they had their Industrial Revolution, so they were technologically leaping ahead of the world. They were militarily rising. They had their age of exploration. Culturally, they were building these big universities. People in Europe thought it was the most obvious thing in the world, that they were the pinnacle of all human history up to that point, beginning with Adam. I mean, maybe. Who knows if even Adam had it this good in the Garden of Eden. They really felt that Europe was the absolute pinnacle of civilization. And in going around and colonizing the world, it was a natural duty to civilize people. Just as parents have a duty to train and civilize their children, it was a moral obligation for Europe to civilize the childlike, mythological, non-rational, non-scientific, non-Christian people of the world, and non-white. That's just the way, that's the way God made it. So, Sir William Jones goes to India absolutely immersed. He hasn't got the slightest doubt that all these things are true. And then he discovered something which he announced to the world in a speech before the Royal Asiatic Society. And this is what he said. The Sanskrit language... Sorry, last interruption. You ever see My Fair Lady? Anyway, the importance of language. Culture is language, is civilization, is status, is everything. Language, like how you talk. If you talk good, you're high class. So, the Sanskrit language, whatever may be its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either. Again, My Fair Lady, the way you speak, especially back then. De Tocqueville, this early sociologist that traveled around America in the 1830s or whatever, from France, he was surprised that in America there was a sort of a homogeneity of language despite Southern accents and New England accents. But still, in America, relatively speaking, people kind of talk the same. Whereas in Europe, say England, literally you go 10 miles down the road, maybe people can't understand each other. Because you have this older civilization, and language really marked you. Like you spoke a certain way, you were low class. You spoke a different way, you were high class. Language was extremely important, and the centerpiece of the Western curriculum for educated people was Greek, Latin, the classics, and so on. So language is central to what they think culture is, and civilization, and everything. Language is absolutely central. So this announcement about Sanskrit, more exquisitely refined than Greek or Latin. This is post-Renaissance. Greek and Latin are super high-class things, and Sanskrit's better than Greek or Latin. Yet Sanskrit bears to them both a stronger affinity. Sanskrit bears a stronger affinity to Greek and Latin, both in the roots of verbs and the forms of grammar than could possibly have been produced by accident. So strong indeed that no philologer could examine them all three languages without believing them to have sprung from some common source which perhaps no longer exists, the proto-language. There is a similar reason for supposing that both the Gothic and the Celtic had the same origin with the Sanskrit, and the Old Persian might be added to the same family. Family! Here you have a bunch of people who are serene, totally committed racists, and they take language as the defining characteristic of culture, and they find out there's all these dark people in the family. In the family. That there's a family relationship with these people of India. And not only that, they're more cultured than we are in some ways. So this was very shocking to Europe. And the response was the immediate, spontaneous creation of a field called Indo-European Studies. Because it now became obvious that Europeans could not understand their own roots, where they came from, unless they understood the origin of India and Indian culture. So there's so much to say about this. Now, a lot of people freaked out. A lot of people thought this is horrible. For example, here's a quote from a standard textbook on this. The extreme Indo-phobic discomfort, with the connection of Sanskrit with Greek and Latin was exemplified by the conviction of the Scottish philosopher Dugald Stewart, who, without knowing a word of the language Sanskrit, proposed that Sanskrit was not a cognative Greek, it was Greek. It had been borrowed by the sneaky Brahmins during Alexander's conquest and adopted to keep their conversations inaccessible to the masses. So, anyway, before this, in Europe, they took it for granted that where we come from, the Garden of Eden. And now they have this idea, maybe there's another Eden. Maybe India was the Eden. Or where do we all come from? Who are we? So this became a very big thing. And now in Europe at the time, this is 1786. Around that time, and picking up steam, you have these tendencies in Europe. One is rationalism. This is post-Newton. There's more and more science. Everything has to be rational. Everything has to be scientific. And at the same time, there's a religious revival going on in Europe. Up till around 1800, the East India Company would not allow missionaries in India. If they caught one on their boat, they'd put them on the next boat back. It was against the law, wherever the East India Company had power, to preach Christianity. Why? It was bad business. I mean, if you open a shop, let's say you open a shop somewhere in Gainesville, and you're just selling some product, like you're selling books or you're selling clothes, and one of your friends is a Christian missionary that wants to stand there in your shop preaching to all the customers. I mean, you're going to throw the guy out because it's bad business. But at 1800, by the time 1800, there was this religious revival in England. It became so strong that people started electing evangelical people to Parliament, and the East India Company was forced to change the rules. So now missionaries could go, and they wanted to convert the Indians. Therefore, there was not only this vested interest in finding out what our roots are, how are we connected to India, what's this family relationship, but also the missionaries felt they had to translate ancient Indian texts into English so that they could understand them and then show the native people of India how stupid their own sacred books were and why they should become Christians. In fact, to this day, the most important Sanskrit-English dictionary that we all use, done by Sir Monier Williams, who held the Bowdoin Chair at Oxford. He held the Sanskrit, the India Studies Chair at Oxford, and he has to apologize in the introduction of his dictionary, and it's still there. It's still there in the introduction of the dictionary, ironically. He has to apologize, or not apologize, but defend himself because he used his chair at Oxford to produce the world's best Sanskrit dictionary, which obviously is not the way you should use the chair at Oxford. The chair at Oxford was endowed to convert Hindus to Christianity. In other words, the Oxford chair, which is still there, it's not really used that way anymore, but the Oxford chair, the Sanskrit chair at Oxford was endowed with terms of the endowment. Whoever holds this chair has to use his position at Oxford to write books and pamphlets and things to convert Hindus to Christianity. And so Monier Williams had to defend himself. He was criticized for wasting his chair at Oxford to produce the world's best Sanskrit dictionary, which is obviously not the purpose of the academic study of India. So, anyway, all this is going on. And then there are people in Europe who are against Christianity, right? If you think back to the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, Voltaire, Rousseau, all these people, there's this huge anti-Christian wave going on in Europe, and they latch on to India and romanticize it, the Romantic movement, the anti-rational, anti-Christian Romantic movement, and they have their own use for India. Everybody's got some use for India. Everybody's got some use for it. And this is the way the academic study started, and a lot of things in your textbook are coming back from that time. They're actually conclusions and theories going back to these times. The English have to justify the colony, so they say actually the ruling people of India, which basically were the North Indians, they were actually white people who invaded India and made the mistake of intermarriage. And so actually the Aryans, because in the ancient Rig Veda, the oldest Sanskrit text, the noble people are called Aryans. The Aryans were actually like us, and they invaded India and civilized the people, but they sort of caved in and intermarried. And so now, because in coming to India as English people, white people, this is just the second wave of the same thing. We have come to aid our Aryan brothers who conquered India thousands of years ago, but then caved in, intermarried, lost their true Aryan identity, and now this is the second wave. We've come to help them. We're doing the same thing they did. Now the Germans didn't have an empire to defend, and so therefore they thought they wanted to establish a special connection with the Aryans. Also, they had a special motivation in their own way because the Germans wanted to somehow see it as that the Aryans came from Germany. So it was actually an Indo-Germanic race. So all over Europe, people are trying to use India for their own purposes and coming up with theories. Now, I want to give one specific example. I've written 12th century ghost story plus 4th century BCE king plus glottochronology equals the date of the Veda. Right? That's obvious. So I want to explain this because I'm going to go into more detail as an example, the kind of scholarship that went on and the kind of scholarship that is still in your textbook. It hasn't changed because people forgot where it came from. Now, the Veda means knowledge. And the most sacred, most ancient scriptures in India are the Vedas. Among them, there's 4 Samhitas. We'll talk about that later. But the most ancient one is the Rig Veda, as I explained. Now, for the Indians, the antiquity of the Rig Veda is absolutely central to everything they hold sacred. That this is the most ancient civilization, and so on and so forth, that it comes from India. So Max Muller was a German scholar that did his work in England in the 19th century. He's the most famous Indologist practically in the 19th century. And he gave a much more recent date for the Rig Veda, which absolutely outraged people in India. He said it might have been composed around 1200 BCE. In other words, about 3,200 years ago, when for the people in India, it was hundreds of thousands of years old. So how did he get this date? And that's the date you've got in your textbook. And that's the date you'll find in the book. How did he get this textbook? Okay, let's go through this. In the 12th century, the 12th century of this era, there was a writer named Somadev, Mr. Somadev, who wrote a book of ghost stories called the Katha Saritsagara, the ocean of rivers of stories. So in this story, now if you know anything about Indian literature, people are not that rigorous about all the time about historical dates and names, because there's a lot of, in fact, that's the nature of pre-Newtonian historiography in general. If you look at the Aeneid by Virgil in Rome, if you look at Homer's works, in general, in ancient times, history was seen as a vehicle for wisdom, and no one got very hung up about things like precise chronology and things like that. So this is the historiographical culture that Somadev is operating in. So in the 12th century, in one of his ghost stories, he mentions a Mr. Katyayana, a man named Katyayana. Now he mentions here, and who knows if this is actual history or not. Oops. Oh my God. Too enthusiastic. So he mentions a Mr. Katyayana Vararuchi, which means Mr. Sort of choice appeal. Anyway, so Katyayana choice appeal, Katyayana Vararuchi, he says, became a minister to a king named Nanda. Now this King Nanda, who was around 350 years before the birth of Christ, about 350 BCE, is sort of a historical figure. So anyway, so Katyayana choice appeal became a minister for this king. Who knows if that's true? There's no record from King Nanda saying, I had a minister named Katyayana. It's just the ghost story says it. And talking about something which took place 1,500 years in the past in a fictional ghost story. So Max Muller says that maybe this character, 1,500 years later in a fictional ghost story, talking about a ministership which there's no historical record for, maybe this is the same Katyayana who wrote some books in the ancient past. Because obviously in the last 1,500 years, only 2 people in India were named Katyayana, right? So, now, if this is the same Katyayana, for which there's absolutely not a shred of evidence, first of all, that this ghost story is even supposed to be history. Secondly, there's absolutely no evidence that it's the same guy. But let's not worry about that. So let's say it's the same guy, and so now we can pin down Katyayana, the sutra writer, the ancient writer, to about 350 BCE. So now, if he wrote a certain genre of ancient literature called sutras, Dharma sutras and so on, about that time, then, so we've got a ghost story plus an ancient king. Now let's add glottochronology. Glotto means language, like a polyglot, not to be confused with glutton. So glottochronology. Now what Max Muller said is that because by linguistic analysis, you can say like the ancient Vedas, let's say, are older. Whatever their absolute dates are, you have a certain genre, a certain layer of literature. It's sort of like linguistic archaeology or something, like geology. So we have a certain layer of literature, then we have another layer of literature called Brahmin literature. And if you study these 2 literatures, by linguistic analysis, linguists conclude this literature came after that one. It's like if you look at Chaucer's English, Shakespeare's English, Charles Dickens, and USA Today. So trying to date the language, they sort of speculate this language is older, this is younger, and then there's another literature which is even newer, and then here, another layer of literature, even more recent, which is our man, Mr. Katyayana. So now, if this is Katyayana, same guy in the ghost story, for which there's absolutely not a shred of evidence, then why don't we just say, just for the heck of it, although there's absolutely no evidence for this either, according to glottochronology, that the earlier literature was written 200 years earlier, and the other one 200 years and 200 years, and so eventually we get back to a date of 1200 BCE for the Veda. Now, there's some things wrong with this picture which I want to talk about. First of all, the first thing I'll mention, and then we'll go from there, is that glottochronology absolutely doesn't work. Glottochronology is basically useless as an analytic tool. Here's a quote. Glottochronology seemed very promising until it was pointed out that languages do not change at standard rates. Languages do not change at standard rates. Lithuanian, for example, which you all know, Lithuanian preserves archaic Indo-European features to this very day. So in modern Lithuanian, there are certain linguistic features which go back thousands of years. And Max Muller is saying everything changes every 200 years. So this method was accordingly discarded as unreliable by most linguists. In Egyptian records, the lapse of 1,000 years made little difference to language and style. The language of King Sargon in the Assyrian records appears to be much the same as that of Nebuchadnezzar about 2 millennia later. So in these records of the Middle East, from King Sargon the Assyrian to Nebuchadnezzar, you have 2,000 years and no change of language. And even Chinese has changed relatively slowly during the last 2,000 years. And yet this was so again, we start with a ghost story, which is not claiming to be historical, but you take a name and figure maybe the same guy as another guy with the same name. It's like some guy's named William today, and 1,500 years ago there was a guy named William, so they're the same person. And then you use glottochronology, and then you come up with this date. So there was this outrage. I mean, Max Muller, when he put forward this theory, the reaction of other scholars was they were outraged. They said, this is ridiculous. And Max Muller himself agreed with them. Here's a quote from Max Muller. Max Muller hastily acknowledged that he only considered his date for the Veda a terminus ad quem. In other words, it couldn't be more recent than that. That's the absolute most recent it could be. He said, I need hardly say that I agree with almost every word of my critics. I have repeatedly dwelt on the hypothetical character of the dates. All I have claimed for them has been that they are minimum dates. And he says, whether the Vedic hymns were composed 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, no power on earth will ever determine. No power on earth will ever determine how old they really are, and yet we have in the textbook this date. Which, from the Indian point of view, basically trashes their sacred culture. Now, not only that, but you find in the, as I said, in India, because they consider it a sacred land, then the Europeans came up with another idea, that Indians aren't from India. They migrated there. First, there was an Aryan invasion theory in the 19th century. How did they come? They felt that, well, since obviously dark people could not come up with this very impressive culture, it must have been created by white people. Because they're the only people with the brain power to write very sophisticated books, like the Vedas. So therefore, the white people must have come into India and done this. So there was a guy named Wheeler, this archaeologist, British archaeologist, around in the beginning of the 20th century, who was excavating the Harappan civilization, this ancient civilization you all read about and studied and will never forget for the rest of your lives. So he was excavating the Harappan civilization, and he came across in one ancient city 2 skeletons, right? We're talking about a civilization with millions of people. Came across 2 skeletons that were kind of like this. And so he thought, well, these were some of the victims of the Aryan invasion. He came across 2 skeletons in one. We're talking about an area of millions of square miles that used to be inhabited by, tens, and, if not hundreds of millions of people in many cities. And he found 2 skeletons and said, well, there was an Aryan invasion. And that was good enough. So everybody decided, yeah, let's go with that. Let's go with the Aryan invasion. Then, when that became discredited, they said, well, there's an Aryan migration. There had to be something because, you see, if Indians are originally from India, then the horrible corollary is the Europeans are originally from India. And they don't want to be from India. So they decided we're not from India. So they started this whole Indo-European quest, like where did this all come from? So they came up, well, Sanskrit can't be the original language. There's a Proto-Indo-European that's now lost. The original language from which almost all the European and Indian languages came, and also Persian and Hittite and other things. It's lost. There's absolutely not a single trace of it. No document, no carving, nothing. No one ever talks about it. But we know there was this original language, which has absolutely no evidence. And they had to find out, okay, then where was the original homeland of the Indo-Europeans? And I have kind of an amusing quote on that, if I can. Oh. So I'll give you a little quote here. These are very great scholars because this is a super hardball major league academic field, Indo-European studies. Because you have to learn like dozens of languages and archaeology and all this stuff. And so you have these very, very bright people to do it. But they can never agree with each other. So the original Aryans have been reconstructed as being nomadic pastoralists, wandering around with sheep or cows. Sedentary agriculturalists, these are the different theories. This will shock you now. Dolichocephalic. I know you can't even believe that. That means having long skulls. Dolichocephalic or brachycephalic, broad, short skulls. Blonde and fair, brown-haired and dark. The Indo-European homeland, these are all different theories. The Indo-European homeland has been located and relocated everywhere from the North Pole to the South Pole. This is really true. I'm quoting this from the most respected textbook on academic book on these things. From the North Pole to the South Pole to China. It has been placed in South India, Central India, North India, Tibet, Bactria, Iran, the Aral Sea, the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, Lithuania, the Caucasus, the Urals, the Volga Mountains, South Russia, the steppes of Central Asia, Asia Minor, Anatolia, Turkey, Scandinavia, Finland, Sweden, the Baltic, Western Europe, Northern Europe, Central Europe, and Eastern Europe. These are a few of the competing theories. So, anyway. Yes?
Was the Rig Veda originally passed down orally?
Yes.
When's the earliest written record of it?
The earliest, writing, according to scholarship, and not all the scholarship is bad, by the way. I mean, some of the scholarship is sort of serious and just scholarship. Some of it is hilarious. The earliest writing we have in India is the rock edicts of Ashoka. There was a great emperor of India, Ashoka, who we talked about last time, who is still a national hero in India. And he's the one sort of patronized and popularized Buddhism. Anyway, he had these sort of Buddhist sayings. He was trying to promote nonviolence and promote sort of good ethical principles. And so all around his empire, which was a good part of India and even other parts of the world, he had these stone pillars put up or stone columns and then engravings put on them with these sayings. And that's the earliest evidence of writing we have. So that was about 2,300 years ago. But everyone agrees that, there was an oral tradition in which they actually memorized this huge Rig Veda down to the slightest phoneme. The reason they had to memorize, I'll tell you this very quickly, is because people believed and still do that the power is in the sound. It's actually in the sound vibration that the power lies, which is exactly the opposite of later philosophies, like Buddhist philosophies, that say language is illusory and ultimately language can't talk about the truth. This view is that the language itself has the power, the sound, the vibration. It's like open sesame, sort of. Anyway, so for example, there's a story, very famous story in this culture that in the Vedas you find this term, Indra. In the Rig Veda, the god who has the most hymns addressed to him is Indra, Zeus. god of rain and thunder. So you find this term, Indra Shatru. Shatru means enemy. So, actually we're just talking about this now in my Sanskrit class, but, so there are different kinds of Sanskrit compounds. This is a compound word. So, it's meant to be, well, there was a Brahmin performing a sacrifice who wanted revenge against Indra because Indra killed his son. So he chanted this hymn to get a person who would be the Shatru, the mortal enemy of Indra. So in ancient Sanskrit, you've got to put the accent here on this word, Indra Shatru, which means the Shatru, the mortal enemy of Indra, who will kill Indra. But the Brahmin, in chanting this mantra, I don't know if he had a senior moment or whatever, but he said Indra Shatru. Now, Indra Shatru means that he will produce from a sacrifice a person for whom Indra will be the mortal enemy. In other words, Indra will kill him. So just because he got the accent wrong, the whole thing backfired. So anyway, so it was memorized very strictly. Now, how old, you say in the book, in the textbook, talk about the Harappan civilization, which is not really just a Harappan civilization because the archaeological sites now extend well into what is now India, the state of Gujarat, and even Rajasthan. And so let's go over some of the evidence for how old is this civilization. Is this really a very ancient civilization, as Indians believe? By the way, regarding the migration, I'll get to that. Regarding the migration of Aryans from outside India, archaeologists have rejected this. Here's a quote from one of the leading South Asian archaeologists, a man named Jen Schaefer, an American scholar who's a very well-known archaeologist of this Harappan thing. Current archaeological data do not support the existence of an Indo-Aryan or European invasion into South Asia at any time in the pre- or proto-historic periods. Instead, it is possible to document archaeologically a series of cultural changes reflecting indigenous cultural development from prehistoric to historic periods. In other words, there's simply no archaeological evidence that at any time in history a significant migration took place into India from outside. So, so how old could these people be? How ancient is this civilization? Could these ancient texts be true? Could there actually be, this very, very old sacred civilization? So I want to talk about a few of those points. There are different fields. One is called, archaeoastronomy. That is, in the ancient Vedas, there are references to star positions, the zodiac. And India, you just like in the Jewish culture, India also, in their religious culture, use the lunar calendar, which is based on not the sun. We have a solar calendar, but the moon. And so there are lunar mansions because, anyway, the zodiac rises and sets every night, and the moon rises in different houses, different lunar mansions. Anyway, so there's a kind of precession because the Earth kind of wobbles on its axis, so therefore the zodiac kind of shifts over time. And so therefore you can look at star positions, and if it says in ancient texts that when a certain event took place long ago in the past, the stars were in this position, you can actually do archaeoastronomy and figure out how long ago was that. How long ago was the sky like that? And so according to archaeoastronomy, some people say that this goes back many, many, many thousands of years. In fact, Jacobi and Tilak, two prominent scholars in the early 20th century, dated certain references in the Rig Veda to 4500 BCE, which is about 6,500 years ago, or 5,000, 4,500, which corresponds to some of the Harappan archaeological dates. So there's archaeoastronomy. There's another point, the Saraswati River. If you know the geography, I haven't drawn as many maps this semester, but just very quickly, India is sort of like, there's peninsular India, where you get, the Indian Ocean, and then it goes up, anyway. Get what you pay for. So anyway, then over here you get Pakistan, and so there's a, and say the Himalayan mountains are up here, and so basically you have this continental divide in India. You have, because of all the snow in these world's highest mountains, you get all this water coming down, and according to the South Indian, the continental divide, some of the rivers go this way into what is now Pakistan, and many of the rivers go this way, like, for example, the Ganges. the Ganges River and the Jamuna River, and there's many other rivers. So they're in the Rig Veda. The civilization is centered around the Saraswati River, the sacred river, the Saraswati River. And that's where the Aryans live, in the Rig Veda. They basically live on the Saraswati River. Now, scholars felt up until very recently that this was a mythological river, like when in doubt, call it mythology. So they felt this was a mythological river. And there was no such thing. The problem is they found the Saraswati with satellite photography, launching satellites into outer space. And through satellite photography, they actually found this massive riverbed of a river which is no longer a river. It's just an ancient abandoned riverbed. And so now it's understood, according to various means, that this was actually the Saraswati River. Now the problem here, again, is that the Saraswati River dried up about 4,000 years ago. So how could you have people 3,200 years ago, the dates we get in our textbooks, talking about an ancient civilization on the banks of the Saraswati when the river dried up 4,000 years ago? And the river was, a full, powerful river many, many, many thousands of years before that. So that's another branch of evidence, all this evidence about the Saraswati River, which shows that actually the Aryan civilization existed in the same place, by the way, the same area where you have the Harappan civilization, because many of the Harappan, that whole Mohenjo-Daro Harappan culture, many of the archaeological sites are on the Saraswati River. So, that's another point. The Saraswati River. Another attempt was made to debunk the antiquity of the ancient civilization by saying that, well, in these ancient literatures they talk about iron. They talk about iron, and since the Iron Age was fairly, recent, therefore the Vedic culture cannot be that old because they talk about iron. Now the word they use for iron often is ayas, which is, anyway, the word ayas. Now here's some facts about that. The earliest mention of, we have ayas mentioned in the Saptapatha Brahman, in the Atharva Veda, different Vedic literatures, but although we only find smelted iron, say as old as 1500 BCE, so they say, well, can't be older than 1500 BCE, but there's iron ore which has been found much older, 1,000 years older, and the iron ore which has been found hasn't even been examined to find out if it was smelted or not. It's like very sloppy, kind of haphazard scholarship. We're not talking about quote-unquote science. And some scholars feel that actually there's a Bronze Age, there's a black metal. First of all, we don't really know what the word ayas means. We don't really know it means iron. It could just mean a dark metal, which could be a type of bronze, which goes back even thousands of years earlier than that. So we don't know what the word ayas means, and yet it was used to say that the Vedic civilization wasn't that old. And then there's the question of horse bones, because horses are mentioned a lot in the Vedas. And they say, well, where are the horse bones? In India, because you don't find so many horse bones. Well, there are other civilizations like in Afghanistan where there's absolute evidence there were horses, but no horse bones. So, and then they did find some bones, they did find some horse bones, but then they said, okay, this is not the right kind of horse. Because they wanted sort of a modern type horse, for which there's a Latin name. But this was an earlier indigenous type of horse, but then they had the world's top expert in horse bones look at it and said, no, this is a modern horse. So then the world's top expert in horse bones basically lost his reputation because he didn't, fall in with the pack. So all this stuff goes on, horse bones, and what does the word ayas mean, and the Saraswati River. So there's this raging debate over how old this civilization is. And I thought this was very funny because you had European romantic agendas, you had European rational scientific agendas, Christian agendas, and then you have Marxist agendas. Because you see, in academia, at a certain point in the 20th century, the baton was passed from the Christians to the atheistic Marxists, and they took over academia, and then that changed, and then you had to reinterpret all of history according to Marxist agenda. I thought that was amusing because in our textbook, the author says that it's the religious people that have the agendas, whereas scholars sit back and in a very detached way simply read the evidence. The history is actually something very different. But anyway, so any questions on that so far? Yes?
Well, why did Hitler take the word Aryan?
Oh yeah, Hitler. One confused soul. So Hitler was sort of like the end of this rage of Indo-European studies. Because in Germany, they were trying to see India as the new Eden. Because the idea was that for too long, Europe, which is now stands on top of the world, has traced its own lineage back to these Middle Eastern people, these Semitic people. And look at these Semitic people. You know, what did they ever do for the world? Yeah, they wrote one good book, the Bible, but apart from that, you know, they're useless. And so therefore it's time, it's like now the Teutonic race, you know, the master race, the Germanic race, can find its origins within itself. We are self-contained. We don't have to borrow from the Semitic people. And so again, this was only one of the many agendas going on here, because every European faction wanted to exploit Indian studies to justify something. Everyone had an agenda. So Hitler, therefore, thought, yeah, he bought into this because he was trying to establish the autonomy and the supremacy of the Germanic people who migrated to India, and so therefore we have our own Eden, we have our own antiquity. So, you know, he used the swastika. The word swastika, by the way, is Sanskrit. The word swastika, su means good, and asti means sort of like, or well, sort of like well and being, and ka means making. So making well-being, that which brings about well-being. That's what the word swastika means. It's sort of a little tarnished now, that word. So anyway, next time, we just have 1 or 2 more minutes. Next time, I just want to tell you all this because when we talk about, quote-unquote, the objective, disinterested academic study of India, this is where it's all coming from. And so Friday, for those, if the world still exists, on Friday, we're going to talk about what was the Vedic culture, what did they believe, what was their life like, who were these people, who were the Vedic people, and what was their religion. So we'll talk about all that on Friday. Yes?
Is there a consensus on the range of dates for the origins of literature, range, you know, from 500 BC?
Well, 1200 BC, maybe to going way back. So anyway, Friday we'll start to get into all the details of the religion of the Vedic people.